Thanks for joining us. This is The Economy. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Today we have a guest traveling from afar, Kevin Shongshe, Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. It's a mouthful, but maybe, Kevin, you can walk through us with Asia Society, the think tank objective, as well as its mission here in Southeast Asia.
Very happy to be on the show, Ibrahim. Asia Society has been around since 1956. It is a US-based nonprofit organization that aims to bring better understanding and better knowledge of Asia to the American audiences. The Policy Institute works on a variety of different relevant policy issues at the intersection of Asia, and the Center for China Analysis aims to bring a sort of inside-out perspective to articulating what is happening in China. It's great to be on the show with you today.
Let's talk a little bit more in terms of the importance of Southeast Asia when it comes to its interpersonal relationship with the larger powers in the world, China and US. We've seen how the ASEAN Summit, for instance, have brought a lot of policy announcements, particularly in how ASEAN and Southeast Asia postulates towards China. Do you think that this would be an area that will be further explored even further in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think Southeast Asia has been a region that has not been neglected by great powers in the past. Now, this year, the host country, Malaysia, has done a tremendous amount of work in putting together a very successful ASEAN summit. It has been able to get enough heads of states and governments to come together in posturing Southeast Asia as a neutral ground for ideas, for narratives, for deals to come together with respect and with relation to China. China has always been in Southeast Asia. Chinese history, diasporas, investments and trade has always been part of that story. With respect to the US, the US have tremendous amount of interest in maintaining their presence in Southeast Asia as well. If you look a bit further at China, I think the first issue to take notice is the China-ASEAN economic relationship. That integration, let's just take trade for example. This year, for the first 9 months, China and ASEAN has already achieved over $780 billion of trade. And that figure is expected to surpass $1 trillion by the end of this year. That figure is the combined of US-China and EU-China trade altogether and more. So that speaks volume to the amount of integration that's occurring across Chinese and ASEAN traders. This year we also saw the China-ASEAN Free Trade Area 3.0 being signed into effect during the KL ASEAN Summit in October. And so with that, I think you recognize the elephant in the room, and happy to dive more into this as we get to it.
Because one would argue that because of the historical mapping that ASEAN has had with China over the past few centuries and over the past few decades, the economic structure of many of ASEAN countries so integratedly, intrinsically mapped towards the Chinese ecosystem, one would argue that it is an economic inevitability. But because of the notion that we've seen how the US and the West in general are now postulating towards trying to make some overtures and deepening their economic ties here in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, for instance, through, say, for instance, President Trump's presence here during the ASEAN Summit a few months ago. One would argue then that the position of ASEAN being a third power dilemma is now put at the crossroads. Do you feel that the level of the middle power dilemma that we're looking at for ASEAN is now going to be tested even further, and some nations, at least within ASEAN, or the constituents within ASEAN, now has to perhaps depart from that middle power notion and start to take sides in order for them to get better deals from their trading partners and elsewhere?
I think it's a great inflection point to look at the history of to what degree has non-alignment worked out for various ASEAN powers, but to take stock of geopolitical realism today and realize that on certain issues, countries have a better aligned incentives with China, for example, to deepen trade, yet on the other side, perhaps to maintain the optionality of engaging American investors. What we're also seeing in the region as well is the rise of interest to engage other relevant stakeholders around the world, including the opportunities to pursue free trade agreements with countries like India, with Australia, with Brazil, with the European Union. And what I think that creates is simply more optionality. And with optionality, you don't find a country locked into a degree of asymmetrical dependency or exposure to vulnerabilities by relying too specifically on one or more countries where you source the majority of your supplies from. And I think what we're seeing there is across different sectors of the economy, nations being able to examine whether there are sector-specific partnerships that they can build. Some would also call it strategic pluralism. For example, working with China, particularly in the area of clean energy, right? So we are seeing an interest of EV cells, of localized EV manufacturing, of investments into battery ecosystems in Indonesia. And there it's undoubtedly that China has both the financing but also the technological upper hand in driving that push. But in other aspects such as semiconductors, which I understand Malaysia has been pushing a lot, there of course you would see a lot of interest in partnering with, for example, US counterparts. So on different issues, you're starting to see countries sort of actively shaping their negotiation strategies, and instead that's a departure from sort of the passive ambiguity that is, you know, one can say maybe categorized their approach for the past couple of decades.
There's this business strategy where it's commonly known by policymakers as China plus one, where businesses and companies and even governments diversify manufacturing and supply chain by adding operations outside of China, by adding China being one of the major ones, if not the major one, but have another one to diversify risk. Do you think that this is a myth, where there's a China plus one myth, so to speak, where in practice meaningfully reducing risk for ASEAN or for Malaysia, for instance, or is it simply just redistributing dependence across just a few familiar nodes, so to speak?
So China plus one started during the first Trump administration. It has continued during the Biden administration, and it is practically what's on every European or American multinational company's mind when it comes to better navigating the operational risk of only having a presence in China. Now, it is, in my belief, both necessary but also a rational decision to be able to manage that risk. For example, take Apple, for example, what they realized at the end of it is that for it to become one of the most successful tech companies in the US with the largest capitalization on the equity market, they've also realized that they have no choice but to work with the Chinese ecosystem and the Chinese government, because China has essentially developed the most suitable, mature, deeply embedded manufacturing ecosystem for Apple. Now they have dense supply networks within China. They have a skilled workforce that's been developed, a hungry workforce, as well as a world-class logistics and infrastructures to support that. So countries in Southeast Asia or in South Asia are, I think, necessary in providing that alternative to multinationals, but also at the same time, it is not fully economic to be entirely isolated or to depart from China, because China still provide the capital equipment, it provide the machineries, even as companies come to Malaysia or Indonesia to have maybe 15 or 20% of that supply chain being here. But at the end of the day, ASEAN does have the opportunity to gain jobs, FDI, export growth from this China Plus One strategy, but also I think just to be aware that it might also come with environmental, it might also come with social costs. So instead of seeing this as competition against China, in fact, I would see it as perhaps a broader Asia regional integration, right? So a manufacturing ecosystem where you have China, you have India, and you have various parts in Southeast Asia that are all sort of interconnected in a way. And I think that's perhaps the picture that we're looking at a couple years down the road.
And then, of course, with China industrial policy, it's been both criticized and admired over the past few decades. Some of them are currently being emulated or at least transferred in some form of or fashion to some of the economies within ASEAN. But there are a few that are fundamentally incompatible with the ASEAN economic or political economic structure. Where do you see that transferable notion of the China industrial policy over the past few decades, and where do you see that incompatibility of structurally, fundamentally incompatible to some of the ASEAN's political economy?
I think there are certainly things that other countries can learn and benefit from China's approach to industrial policy. I think one is naturally that amount of state playing that constructive and positive role in coordinating between industry, banks, and government support in order to drive down the cost of production, in order to provide the scale or the infrastructure that can lead to scaling of manufacturing. China's political system allowed it to operate or experiment or even to fail, but it might not necessarily be in the ASEAN countries' nature to be able to pursue these industrial strategies, given, for example, a more tighter fiscal environment, perhaps also more political fragmentation amongst both within but also intra-ASEAN countries. But I think what ASEAN policymakers or industries can consider is be selective and disciplined with regards to what you're looking to build. What are the industries where you have that natural advantage? For example, for Indonesia, because of their endowment in critical minerals, they have the possibility of building out a clean energy supply chain in Indonesia. For Malaysia, is that question with regards to data centers? Is that question with regards to semiconductors? Is that with electric vehicles? Right? And to be able to also consider intra-ASEAN trade and to specialize in areas where one could do better. But given the history of ASEAN's openness towards FDI, its openness towards ability to integrate into multiple regional value chains, of that sort of non-aligned principle with regards to great powers or middle powers from other regions, I personally believe the ASEAN have the capability to tap into industrial policies that work very well. But I think the key there is that coordination between state as well as the banks and the industries to formulate a strategy that works for your specific country.
Let's move into industry specific. Let's start off with climate transition and clean energy. We've seen a few markets in ASEAN that are taking very aggressive steps in terms of embracing clean energy. Say, for instance, in Indonesia, they're looking at nickel management as being produced at their domestic end and not just export the raw minerals out. In Malaysia, the carbon capture and utility storage bill has just been passed by the parliament, and further developments are needed there. In Thailand, for instance, EV manufacturing is now moving into battery as well. While I would argue that many of these markets are actually complementing each other, there is also that element of reliance towards China being the producer of, say, for instance, rare earth, where 95% of the production comes from there. Do you feel that there is an opportunity for ASEAN to go deep into clean energy, or do you think that this is just creating yet another level of interdependence with the Chinese economy?
Let's talk about rare earth in a second, but let's just take a look at clean energy. Now, China has been successful in driving down the cost of clean energy for the world. From a climate perspective, that creates a product where the global south can buy into. Now, clean energy products such as EVs and batteries and solar panels are also constructive or conducive in addressing some of the issues that Southeast Asia countries or cities are facing, including air pollution, including urban health, including climate resilience, as we most recently are aware of the multiple landslides and the flooding that had occurred across Southeast Asia in a couple of different countries. Now, you've noted that Southeast Asia policymakers and industries are already attracting Chinese FDI into the region by localizing some of the manufacturing of electric vehicles, batteries, and whatnot in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Indonesia. Now, these investments are intended, I think, to allow the creation of jobs. They're also leveraging to some degree local resources. But the key here is not to get countries in Southeast Asia stuck in a position where they're only doing the final assembly, right? You want to be able to think about leveraging that entry point to build out a further couple nodes alongside the value chain. For example, to move downstream into services or more upstream into components and engineering. You also want to think about how do you use that FDI as a platform to encourage some degree of knowledge or technology transfer, right? So then you're also upskilling your workers. And how do you tap into that innovation? If China's the only country that's at the forefront of clean energy innovation, how do you form a partnership with a country that's driving that forward? What does it mean that the U.S. is out of the picture in terms of driving clean energy innovation and businesses forward? So it is, in clean energy, I believe it's that next frontier, right? Because it also ultimately enhances on one's ability to secure energy security by producing or generating electricity from within your country's jurisdiction instead of relying on imports of oil and gas. So I think there's multiple.
There's also that element of laws that needs to be changed within the respective markets, either in carbon tax or a transfer of or the sale of energy from one country to another, for instance. But because of the geopolitical situation right now that is currently happening, and with the general idea of reduction of reliance towards OPEC or reliance or reducing reliance to the US energy markets and so on, do you feel that clean energy is going to be a major political topic at these various ASEAN markets in order for them to then facilitate these kind of opportunities that they can actually expound on?
I think clean energy is not simply an environmental or a climate discussion point. The fact that China has been able to draw down the cost of production means that clean energy goods have a material chance of challenging the traditional fossil-based, hydrocarbon-based economy that we rely upon. Now, it is, of course, not overnight where you can push away and introduce new interest and power in the room. But I think for countries like Indonesia, that is suffering tremendously from these environmental issues, that have the endowment of natural resources, as well as the demographic dividend of workers to be trained into engineers and participating in these economies, I think it makes sense, right? And look at Malaysia, where it is, has its own own automobile brands, right? For a country that's also capable of exporting cars into the region as a hub, I think it's important for Southeast Asian countries to be able to think forward, because these technological innovations, the fact that China has driven down the cost, is going to disrupt markets in a way that within the blink of an eye, in a couple years, you're going to see a lot more EVs running on the streets. If you travel to Shanghai or Shenzhen today, over 50% of the new car sales within these cities are clean energy vehicles.
And not just that, garbage trucks, buses, whatever, transport vehicles, they're all EVs now. And that is, but you know, the change took place over the past decade maybe. But you know, if you've been to China in 2010 and then you went to China yesterday, you would not recognize it any longer in terms of ICE vehicles versus EV vehicles on the road. But we'll pause that topic of clean energy for a bit. We'll go into that topic of minerals because today nickel, rare earth, lithium are considered as political assets and geopolitical assets. But ASEAN has made the mistake of being resource rich but value poor by keeping the sale of these geopolitical assets, so to speak, nickel, rare earth and lithium and so on, at the lower end and not producing it and developing it domestically or at least regionally. Do you think that ASEAN has what it takes to learn from its previous trap of these commodity cycles and actually expound upon higher value chain activities and perhaps attract investors into this space even further, and in fact from clean energy as well, so that you have a rather comprehensive selling point or proposition towards investors. There's clean energy, there's critical minerals and so on.
I think the objective is both noble but also highly important. The whole discussion here is about, can you control a design, a strategy, or a pathway towards real value creation, right? I think resource nationalism without a strategy would end up repeating that old mistake. I think there's a few things going on here. I think one is, can ASEAN nations invest in parallel in skills, in processing, and in good governance, so that as the money flow in, you're also building, you're training workers that are able to be upskilled, you're also obtaining that manufacturing process knowledge, right? You're also enhancing to a certain degree your ability to regulate and to a certain degree be transparent. I think that is going to be critical in alongside when you build out that clean energy upstream critical mineral node in the value chain. I think mineral policies should not depart from the same community or the same environment where these minerals are coming from, right? That means sound environmental standards, sound social credibility. How are you dealing with the communities that are displaced? Are you paying attention to the conservation of the biodiversity of the region? How are you coordinating between this sort of federal, national level critical mineral policies with the local regulators and the local decision makers? Are you inserting yourself to be able to be part of that industrial ecosystem moving forward? And from that upstream, then you can look more downstream and look at where are the next nodes? Is it batteries? Is it electric vehicles? How do you link these together? But I think to start, it requires degrees of good governance. And I think good governance with investments, that triangulation between industry, investments, and education is really important. And
skills transferability as well, that's the key part here.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the development realities versus climate transition. Realpolitik speak. Many of these ASEAN emerging economies are starving of developments, infrastructure building, and so on. And when we talk about energy transition, it's most often spoken of in morality terms. Where do you think is the hardest trade-off between climate ambition versus affordability and industrial needs of these ASEAN nations?
I think for ASEAN nations that are developing economies, you cannot pursue decarbonization without making it compatible with development. You cannot pursue energy transition at the expense of your economic competitiveness. The trade-off is true because if you're not focused on allocating your most immediate resources to delivering on the more immediate priorities in healthcare or education, you're not necessarily going to be able to invest that amount of capital or resources into the long-term climate issue, right? I think for ASEAN, climate policy must be able to connect with the delivery of jobs, right? It must be able to connect with the development reality of the regions. So take climate disasters, for example. Take the flooding that has just occurred. You know, I think
in Aceh, where thousands have died.
In Aceh, in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, and these all happen over, you know, weeks. You know, I think it's so easy to forget that if you invest $1 in there today in preventing the future possibility of a climate catastrophe, you actually save more dollars on that one investment today. Right? It has to go back to taking care of the communities that you come from. In climate adaptation, I think climate adaptation, it's so important for Southeast Asian economies because folks in communities, if you can be able to invest resources in training them to be better guardians of their own safety, of being better able to prevent or foresee or be able to better manage disasters through workshops or trainings, that's investing in the future. You cannot be shutting off a coal-fired power plant if you don't have the alternative to be able to generate electricity. So I think the contradiction there is difficult because Southeast Asia alone does not necessarily have the resources to pursue energy transition on its own.
Which begs that question of financing these transitions. Do you feel that the current mechanism to fund climate transition is in place, or do you feel that this is yet another mechanism where it is structurally biased towards more advanced economies and not necessarily going to work for ASEAN economies?
I mean, there are going to be catalytical finance coming from philanthropic organizations, the regional multilateral development banks, to pilot or to test out an early stage project. But I think the real opportunity lies in making sense of private investments to come in that can truly be able to help de-risk mechanisms and build public-private partnerships in climate mitigation or climate adaptation. The real challenge for the region is that the climate funding gap is so large that simply governments or investors from philanthropies or multilateral development banks are simply not enough. So how do you make the case for private investors to be willing to invest in financing the energy transition? How do you get the attention of Western financiers? How do you use sovereign guarantees to help de-risk these various mechanisms? You know, I think it really begs the question of how, and you know, we are running out of time. But besides funding climate mitigation, how do you fund climate adaptation? Like, how do you have the funds to build sponge cities, right? Of course, you know, governments can pursue strategies to build out sponge cities, but can you make it investable? Can you make that? Can you put that on the desk of a private equity investor and say, how do you generate a return off of it? I think that's the key question to consider.
It's now 2026, the decade ahead. Where do you see the single biggest mistake ASEAN could make in managing its economic relationship with China? And what do you think ASEAN economies need to do to get that right in terms of avoiding this single biggest mistake?
I think any country should not get into the false hope that by default you're going to be secure or protected from the geopolitics that are happening in the world. I think for ASEAN nations, there are sort of two things that you can do. One is to understand that, yes, you have so many priorities, but how do you prioritize? What are the most important issues? One, I would say, is keeping peace at home and building that cohesion, right? I mean, 2025 has been, on paper, a good year for Southeast Asia, but if you look just a bit further, you realize that climate resilience, you realize
domestic policy, China, Cambodia, Thailand, Cambodia.
Yeah,
the
little conflict, the cohesion, right? So how?
But on paper, it looks all good.
On paper, it looks great, and I think optically, the ASEAN summit delivered on what it's supposed to do. But also, I think the number two is how do you really align the incentives between countries, intra-ASEAN countries? So then you both have, you all have, of course, your own agenda, but can you really define that collective agenda and posture ASEAN as a region that is not divided, and to be able to sell it and use its collective power to be able to muscle on the international stage? I think that's a question that's yet to be figured out. And by being deliberate, by being cohesive, you can integrate, you can shape rules, you can form coalitions. I think that's the direction that you need to go. But I think 2025 has been a mix of a good and bad year for Southeast Asia. I think there's a lot in 2026 that we'll have to watch out for as well.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was Kevin Songshe Lee, the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis, joining us, not just on this show, but joining us for the first time in his adult life in Kuala Lumpur. Thank you very much, Kevin, for coming over. Here at Astro AWANI, we present some of these shows where we discuss policy matters as well. So do check it out on astroawani.com. But for now, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Catch you in the next one.